People with psychosis are vulnerable and they often need care from their loved ones to help them stay safe. Some people are fortunate enough to have a spouse or family members who can adopt the role of caregiver to help them navigate daily life and keep them out of dangerous situations, but not everyone is that fortunate. In my case, I didn't have anyone in my life at the time that I went into psychosis to help me through what was happening, and this left me vulnerable to everyone and anyone around me. So my life was left up to the will of other people, anyone who could get to me first. When you're left up to the devices of whoever is around, you inevitably can fall into the hands of really bad people with really bad intentions who can gaslight you and coerce you because your reality is so malleable and so easily influenced that you can go along with anything. At least that's what happened to me when I married my ex-husband. I went into psychosis in November of 2017, and by December of 2017, I was already incredibly far gone. I whipped past the insight stage into anosognosia, had no idea I was in psychosis, fully immersed in my symptoms, just homeless for one thing. I had been evicted in that month and I was couch surfing, and I reconnected with a man that I barely knew. We had met in a crisis center years before, basically having had our own mental health emergencies, wound up locked up together in a mental health facility. And all these years later, I don't know how, but I found him. Maybe I ran into him somewhere and we started hanging out. I wound up in a relationship with this man immediately. I had no business making my own life decisions, and yet here I was practically living with this guy who swooped me in off the street and gave me a place to stay and told me he loved me, and we had an incredibly short courtship. We dated for 1 week before he proposed to me. He impulsively got down on one knee one day walking to the car, I don't know, to get groceries or something, and proposed. No ring, no buildup, no romance, just got down on one knee because he had a feeling. And given that I didn't really know what was happening because I thought he was a god and that demons were after my soul, and this was my ticket to salvation to save my soul from the demons that were after me, I said yes. I was clearly not getting into it for the right reasons because, again, I thought I was saving my soul from demons by doing this, so it felt like I had no other choice. And also, he was God. Like, you don't say no to marrying God. That's everybody's dream come true. That's the ultimate blessing. Who doesn't want to be God's wife? Marrying the big man upstairs? That's dope. I wanted that. Anyway, the engagement lasted another week. So we dated for 1 week, we were engaged for 1 week, and we married. So the time span of this entire relationship was 2 weeks before I was married to this man. And we had the most perfunctory wedding I could imagine. There was no romance. It was clinical. It was so incredibly stripped and barren of any tradition, any romance, any say in what we could have. He didn't want to spend very much money on it, so we didn't have a reception or anything. We didn't have a cake. He didn't want to have anyone involved, so I was not allowed to have my family. I was not allowed to have guests. I was not allowed to have friends. So even though I had asked if my dad could officiate because he's a deacon, he said no. When I asked if I could tell my family we were getting married, he said no. So I had to keep our marriage a secret before we even got married, and I was not allowed to tell a single living soul. This meant that we had no witnesses on our wedding day, and we actually forged signatures of people we made up on the marriage license because it was just us and an officiant he'd found on Craigslist the day before. I was majorly disappointed. I may have been psychotic and unaware of what was really going on, but I was aware enough to know that I had completely had my dreams dashed. You know, everybody has an image in their mind of what a wedding is like. and I thought at the very least there'd be one person in attendance. So this was a crushing moment for me, and as I think it would be for anyone who has been looking forward to marriage and daydreaming in their mind about what kind of cake or dress they'd have. I did not think my wedding day would be a rushed, urgent matter, because he insisted we had to get married right away. When I'd asked if we could hold off for like at least a few months to plan a real wedding, he said that we had to do it by this day. We had to, no matter what. I have no idea what is wrong with this man. There is something pathologically wrong with this man, and I still have not figured it out. I think on some level he has his own mental illness. I'm not sure what, but there is something very, very wrong with this man. And it played out in our marriage. Our marriage lasted, I think, 5 months. These were the longest months of my life, and so much harm came out of this time, especially because as a person with psychosis, I was so heavily influenced by everything he told me, and the things he told me were straight up lies. Like I said before, I believed he was a god. And this was largely because he told me he was a god, and he told me that I was a god, and he told me that we were immortal and we could choose to die whenever we wanted, and that he wanted to live for hundreds of years. And the most romantic thing he could think to do would be to die together in a plane crash. And he said that we had godlike abilities, and that we could teach lessons to mortals, and that we could communicate telepathically. He would tell me things about the way the world worked, how Africa wasn't real, because as a god, nothing existed beyond his perspective. So until he approached something, it wasn't real, it was a concept. So a map of Africa was a concept of a place that wouldn't exist until he appeared there. Things like that. This messed up my head, understandably. Anyone with psychosis who is told some sort of a confirmation by a person outside of their experience will latch onto it very strongly, because we will look for any proof we can that things are true. So if you tell someone with psychosis that something is true that is not, we will just hold on to that so firmly as another layer of reasoning behind our delusions for why, with conviction, we are justified in believing the things we do. And when someone with bad intentions gives you lies like this, it's gaslighting. It completely warps your mind. It shapes your reality. They are creating your reality by feeding you this information that's not true, and it is disastrous. It can cause a lot of really negative things. For me, this really amplified my symptoms. It also made the recovery phase so much harder, because recovering from psychosis entails deconstructing your memories to understand reality, understand what really happened versus what was false. It can be incredibly hard to pick apart these memories, especially when the memories you're given are presented as people telling you things that are so obviously not true, and still trying to discern whether that happened. Like looking back on these memories and thinking there's no way I was a god, but then having the confirmation from someone telling me I am, it was very confusing to know what actually happened. I was deep in psychosis for most of this marriage. The only way I got out of this marriage was by literally running away in the middle of the night, which is on its own an entirely different video, because it is just as involved as this one. But ultimately he refused to take me to the hospital, and I thought I needed to go because at one point I thought I was pregnant with Satan's baby, and I wanted to do something about that, and he refused to take me. He said that he had promised himself he would never take me to the hospital. Mind you, he knew that I have schizoaffective disorder, because as I said, I'd met him in a crisis center, and back then I had told him how many times I had been to the hospital for psychosis. So he knew what psychosis was. He had seen it for himself. There's no way he didn't know something was wrong with me, because at one point I was literally age regressing and not even knowing how to shower or use a toilet. And he just kept insisting he wouldn't take me to the hospital. I literally had to take it into my own hands and run away from home while he was asleep to get to the hospital. That was the only way that I got treatment, was making that life-saving decision, which in psychosis I didn't really know I was doing. I got on medication and it started to work. It took several months before it started to work, but in those months I started to have pockets of clarity where I understood that I had psychosis and that I was coming out of it and that these were my symptoms. And the more clear-headed I became, the more horrified I was to understand the severity of my situation, the gravity of this relationship, what was going on that he was doing to me, and not knowing how to get out because it was a legally binding relationship. Because that's the only way I see my marriage, my old marriage. I see it as being legally bound to another person. And that is the only way that relationship makes sense to me, was because I was put in a situation where I could not consent. I legally could not consent. People think consent is a thing of age, like not being old enough to consent. Consent has a lot more to do with other factors like, coercion, being under duress, inebriation if you're too under the influence to consent, and in my case, mental incapacitation, which is what the courts deemed me when I ultimately got an annulment. Thank God for my dad, because he is not only a deacon, he is a lawyer, and he clued me in on what an annulment is. And no one in my family directly told me to leave this man, but they all gently nudged me, because after several months, it did come out that I was married. Everybody was shocked and horrified to find out that I had married a stranger, because last they'd heard from me, I was still dating my old boyfriend that I was living with. Then there was a huge gap of no communication because my ex-husband wouldn't let me speak to my family. He made me go no contact with my entire family. And then he finally gave me permission to talk to them. And they all found out that this daughter they hadn't heard from in months was married to a man no one had heard of before. And that I was also psychotic. So it was pretty clear to them something was incredibly wrong with me, that this situation was super fucking bad, super fucking abusive. So my dad, very gently, as I was coming out of it, starting to understand, was saying, there's annulments. You might want to look into that. Like, you qualify for an annulment. There are grounds to an annulment, and I met one of the categories of mental incapacitation. You see, annulments aren't like what they show in the movies, where it's this thing of you get married, you don't have sex, and then you can annul the marriage because you didn't have sex. Like, first of all, that makes no sense. Second of all, they're incredibly strict, and you have to meet certain criteria to be eligible for an annulment. You can't just get one. You can't just annul your marriage and have it wiped off the slate. So some reasons people get annulments are marrying a minor, marrying within their blood, like an incestual marriage, having polygamy, like a polygamous marriage of having multiple spouses, marriage under the influence of alcohol or another substance, being inebriated at the time of marriage, because in that case you couldn't consent. In my case, I couldn't consent. And I was, like I said, deemed mentally incapacitated, which means that due to my mental illness, I could not make decisions with reasonable discretion. I could not care for myself with reasonable discretion. And in that state, it could not have been possible for me to discern that this was legally a good idea. I couldn't have known. And the courts understood that, and I was granted an annulment. One side note is that when the judge asked my incredibly cocky ex-husband why he thought it was okay to marry me when I was so clearly psychotic, he said, "I just thought she was quirky." I gave them a 23-page document from my hospitalization detailing every single thing that had happened while I was there, including refusing food because I thought it was human flesh, and flickering light switches because I thought I was in control of day and night, and on was day and off was night, and really batty things that are clearly not normal. But yeah, I was just quirky. Let's go with that. Anyway, from there, my life was at rock bottom. I had to scramble to figure things out. My mom let me stay on her couch for a couple weeks, and then I ended up moving in with a friend. I had no income. I lost my entire income when I got married because I have SSI, and no one tells you straight up that you lose your income when you get married. So there was that. I had to reapply. I think they gave me some money back after the annulment because legally that marriage had never happened. I was incredibly traumatized, and I'm still working through that. There was a no contact order because he continued to harass me. He broke the no contact order. I was subpoenaed, ultimately told that I was not fit to stand trial or something like that. So it was an ongoing thing for years. I have him out of my life today, but I think I've seen him in public 3 times since the no contact order, and every single time my heart rate has completely jumped and I start hyperventilating and I run away. So there is a lasting effect from him, and it is not good. And I am so incredibly triggered by motorcycles because he is a motorcyclist. I am triggered by bald men because he is bald. It took me months to come around to my friend Omi after meeting him because he is bald. And I've since understood that you can be friends with bald men and not feel triggered by that specific person. But across the board, I am triggered by bald men. I am triggered by black socks because of his socks. I am triggered by certain foods that he fed me. It was the most traumatic experience of my life. So yeah, if you want to consider people with psychosis to be incredibly violent, consider this. It is statistically proven that people with psychosis are just as likely to commit violent acts as neurotypical people. That is to say that 50-50, we commit just as many violent acts as you. It is more common than not for a person with psychosis to receive harm than to inflict harm, because violence is incredibly rare amongst that population, but abuse is not. Neglect and coercion and manipulation and whatnot, those are far more common than violence. This is because it is an incredibly vulnerable population. Think of children, think of people with dementia. They are incredibly vulnerable. Psychotic people are within that realm, because they cannot make decisions with reasonable discretion. They cannot protect themselves. They often put themselves in dangerous situations. They have no reasoning and logic. They cannot make rational insight. So people like me are more likely to be the kind of person you'd come across. My story is not common. Things like what happened to me don't happen, but people who are neglected and abused in psychosis, I'm more likely the person you'll meet than someone who's violent. So I just want people to bear in mind that these are people that deserve care, right? These are not monsters. These are people like anyone else deserving of care and love, and you're still a person behind your illness. It's not that the psychosis takes over and becomes your whole identity. I'm still myself when I'm psychotic. I'm still Carolyn. I still have my feelings and my views. Maybe I have different beliefs, but I am afraid, just as I would be in a situation like that. Just because what's happening to me isn't real doesn't mean that my emotions and my reactions aren't real, because they're still coming from a place that is intrinsically me. So I wish I'd had the care that I deserved. People deserve care. People need care. What we need a lot less of is the stigma of violence, because I am living proof that people with psychosis are far more likely to receive violence than to inflict violence.